Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Red Lines, a show where we dive into daring subjects and cross some red lines of political speak. Today, we're going to be talking about what a NATO membership for Ukraine would actually look like, and whether we can expect conversations about that at the next Ramstein meeting. I have with me Anna from Ukraine and Denis Davydov.
Nice to see you
Hello.
guys.
Anna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much. Really happy to be with your community. My name is Anna and I'm from Ukraine. It may seem like a very simple introduction, but in these times it means a lot. And I'm really glad that YouTube helps me shape a very good community on the channel and provide updates from Ukraine from an ordinary civilian perspective.
It's awesome. And Denis?
Hi guys, my name is Dennis. I'm the YouTuber. Have my own kind of the big YouTube channel, also about the war in Ukraine, about the topics around Ukraine mainly. And as Anna, I'm also from Ukraine. Before the war had started, I was the airline pilot, but started to review the situation around my country. And now it's the full-time job, and I'm really happy to spread the word about Ukraine.
That's amazing. Well, let's spread some word about Ukraine today as well. There is the next Ramstein meeting coming up, and it's likely going to be, it's the first meeting that Biden is attending and the last. And I'm wondering if NATO integration of Ukraine is going to be mentioned in a different way this time. It looks like there was a Financial Times article where a Ukrainian NATO integration based on Germany's example in World War II was mentioned and discussed, and whether it's a possibility. And I'm wondering if Western politicians are finally starting to realize that the only way to end this war is Ukraine in NATO and a full, complete Russian destruction militarily. What do you think?
Well, it seems like everybody's talking about this article in Financial Times, and it is actually good that these are not like conspiracy theories or thoughts people express simply on their kitchen conversations. So hopefully there are some shifts in the attitudes. I know that the only way to achieve lasting peace, not just in our part of the world, but in general, is to demilitarize Russia, to defeat it. And honestly, this will be better even for the Russians if you look at the number of their losses on the front lines and in general the isolation of the country in itself. What is important is to understand that like nobody trusts Russia in Ukraine, and hopefully politicians, global decision makers finally realize that no agreement, no appeasement is possible, because as long as Russia has people and has weapons, also provided by their authoritarian allies, it will be able to continue the war. And the only way to protect Ukraine, to protect democratic values, is actually to make us a member of NATO. And honestly, once again, maybe Denis will provide a more military perspective, but as a civilian observing the achievements and inventions inside the Ukrainian armed forces and real battlefield experience, I believe we deserve that. And it's actually good that lots of Ukrainian soldiers report that after their training visits to NATO countries, they feel there is something they can teach our NATO partners, because once again, perhaps this is the biggest war since the Second World War. It is a very modern war with drone airfare, with lots of new technologies introduced. And hopefully, this will be mutually beneficial for Ukraine and NATO, for Ukraine to be finally in NATO. Hopefully, we will hear some news. Of course, there are speculations. What's the price? Will this be Ukrainian territories or something else? But we have to live and see, I guess.
Yeah, totally agree that the NATO is now the only project, the only military security guarantee for any sort of the country, not just for Ukraine. It's the best security alliance, military alliance existing in the world, which Russia is honestly afraid of. They say that NATO was the reason for them to invade Ukraine, actually, but since that time, NATO expanded. And, currently we may say that yes, Russia has severe losses, but they have tremendous population compared to Ukraine, so they still have those resources to continue this war. And there is the risk that if we, for example, freeze the current uh, conflict war between Ukraine and Russia, as we see politicians are pushing Ukrainian government to freeze the war. They do not ask Putin at the same time what he wants, because I think that Russia wants to continue. But let's say, okay, the war stopped. Without security guarantees for Ukraine, what will make Russia to stop after all? They may reform their army, hire more army men, more personnel, produce more armored vehicles, get more shells from North Korea, Iran, and they may attack Ukraine again. By the time the world could be blind about Ukraine, like it would be long forgotten topic, like after 2 years, 3 years, so the time would be required for boost again the military support of Ukraine, but it could be too late. Like Russia may introduce lots of the forces and they may go occupy Kiev this time, because the last time in 2022 they used quite limited number of the forces to go to Kiev. Now they have actually the larger army with more military experience. Now the current Russian army is not what it was in 2022, unfortunately. Yes, they have the problems with severe losses, but it's not that great issue compared to the population they have relative to Ukraine. So I think that NATO is absolutely must have if we speak about the scenario of possible peace talks or freezing the war. The other solution is to give Ukraine absolutely everything for Ukraine to liberate its territories, but it seems like our allies are not willing actually to give us everything. As we see, we have just limited support, enough for Ukraine to hold on, but in a long-term perspective, the solution with NATO is must have.
Well, in my understanding, the solution with NATO would only work if those. So let's say, I mean, it's really hard to speculate about NATO, right? Because in terms of us Ukrainians, what territories do we include? Let's say we include the territories that Ukraine controls right now, and then we add step by step the territories that Ukraine will liberate in the future. Like as soon as they're liberated, they're NATO territory, right? That could keep Russia at bay, but only if we have the same security guarantees as the rest of NATO allies, which means that that will deter Russia from attacking the territory that's already in NATO. In that case, yeah, Ukraine can return territories very quickly because, I mean, Russia has a very big mouth, but we know Russia is not going to attack NATO, right? Because if it's a NATO ally or if it's someone in NATO, then NATO is not going to be dragging its feet nearly as much as it's doing now. I'm curious, like let's imagine this happens. Let's imagine this happens and Ukraine has defeated Russia and everything is good and jolly, right? I think what people are not talking about is what does Russian defeat actually look like? Because to me, the only Russian defeat where Russia is not going to come back in the same way as Russia comes back every time is if Russia has a very similar scenario to Japan and Germany in World War II, where it's not only demilitarized, but it's also under control of Western nations, where they're re educated. But by re educated, I mean debrainwashed. Because at this point, you know, when people tell me about good Russians or about how they don't understand why Russians are also brainwashed, I, to me, it's kind of funny as a Ukrainian because if we look at Hitler and we look at Germany, Hitler took three generations of Germans: the kids, the adults, and the elderly. I mean, also, again, I always mention that there are still Nazi sympathizers and people that believe that ideology today, unfortunately. But in the big picture, it was three generations of people. How many generations of Russians believe that they're the best nation in the world? How many generations of Russians believe that they're superior to everyone? How many generations of Russians believe that they are like the chosen nation and that they should be an empire? Hundreds of generations. So how do you deal with that?
That is a very good question, Yulia, and unfortunately, we don't see it often touched in various global discussions. One of the things, and actually missions perhaps of Ukrainian YouTubers, is to try and translate, explain Russian imperial character to the rest of the world. Why? Because the majority of even big countries, former empires, they went through this process of de-imperialization, decolonization back in the 19th century or at the very beginning of the 20s. And when they discuss about these arguments for Russia, they actually feel that Russia is something similar to them, when in reality it is a totally different country that actually survives because of war. Without war, it will be very difficult to keep all the territories together and, for example, to keep Putin at power. So they are not looking for the end of this war. They are looking for eternal wars with weaker countries, because they always choose weaker countries. Let's be honest. Maybe we are stronger in our motivation, in the way we treat people, and so on, but in numbers, in the amount of people that can actually join the army. And that is what we witnessed with Georgia, with Chechnya, with former Soviet republics that are in danger. And Russia continues to live with this imperial pains, and the only way to keep the empire is to extend. That is how they survive. We all know that despite all this Russian propaganda, nobody wants to, like, you don't see huge waves of immigrants coming to Moscow for the values or university studies or, I don't know, nature or whatnot. Everybody feels that life in Russia is a little bit just like it was in the 19th century to some extent. So to keep the economy rolling, to create workplaces and so on, they actually need war, and they use it as an opportunity to expand and continue to be an empire. What is also bad, actually, their politicians, maybe crazy like Medvedev, but they tell it openly. They actually speak their ideas to the world, and people are suffering from what my community on YouTube often calls as normalcy bias. Like you are normal and you don't think someone will come and, I don't know, stab you, because you wouldn't do that. But unfortunately, maniacs exist, and maniac empires still exist. And what we experience right now is the agony of this empire. And there are indeed lots of dozens of generations that knew Russia only as an empire. Tsar Empire, Soviet Empire, now this restoration of the Soviet Union or whatever. And what is really bad, that we see that lots of military and political decisions are made with this idea that we need to preserve Russia in its modern borders. And sometimes you get a feeling that Russia is also like not just Ukraine protected, but Russia, the very idea, the very image that Russia created. And actually, when I speak with some colleagues abroad, very few understand, maybe they know, but very few understand that the Russian Federation consists of 22 national republics, and Russia is actually just one of them. And if you look at Chechnya, or if you look at Tatarstan, these people have totally different histories, religions, languages, and even tried to become independent. It was simply suppressed. And if people are so much afraid of the collapse or dissolution of the Russian Federation, if it happens after the defeat, then perhaps we should start thinking how we can control this process. It was not our choice, I don't know, to defeat Russia, to make them collapse, but Putin and millions of his supporters, millions of Putins did not leave us a choice. And the only way is now to defeat them. And honestly, I don't know why so many people use nuclear weapons as an argument, saying like, what if Kadyrov will control nuclear weapons? How will you feel? Well, I don't feel well when Putin controls them. And actually, if Putin is defeated, Russia is seriously reformed with the influence of the democratic countries, Kadyrov is no more a leader anywhere. He is in the same prison cell together with Putin. So the only thing we should do is actually start visualizing this kind of future and how we can interfere and help these poor zombified Russians to try what democracy is. Because once again, if you look deep into the darkness of Russian history, please give me an example of at least a decade when Russia was a democratic country. You won't find it. Their beloved leaders, top top heroes of the country are always Ivan the Terrible, Stalin, now Putin. That's what they like. So it is totally irresponsible, and unfortunately many, especially EU leaders, continue doing that. Totally irresponsible to hope that, let's say, after Putin is off the Kremlin stage, Russians will develop democracy. Russians will start shaping something. No, they don't know how to do it. And actually, if we are good democratic citizens, it is our task, and sometimes it may be difficult. The denazification of Germany was not a sweet process, but that's actually quite okay. And even those Russians who fled the war and now are abroad, far away from the reach of the FSB agents, I don't see them uniting even in civic unions, civic movements, not political, to at least try and support some changes inside Russia. So, unfortunately, it is the task of the democratic countries around, and hopefully, our tolerance will not prevent us from doing the right thing.
Well, these people actually, before Denis says something, if he wants to, I really want to trail off what you said here. Is the Russians not really doing anything? So I was at Action Ukraine Summit last week, and I met some Ukrainians back in Ukraine from Poltava who were invited here. They don't really speak English very well. They do, but not very well. They were invited here by an organization in America to the ceremony of awarding Karamurza and Tikhanovskaya or whoever some awards for their contributions to international society, which are both Russian opposition leaders who have not accomplished, and I say this responsibly, anything. I don't mean that just because I'm Ukrainian. I mean, if you look at it, they have not accomplished anything within Russia or within Belarus. Nothing. No movements have started, no progress has been made, nothing. They're not necessarily looking for a new Russia or for a new Belarus. They're looking to replace the old leaders and be more efficient than them. So Russians are not doing anything. Russians are waiting patiently before they can have a new leader, before the world resets, because in the mind of Russian people, basically they invite Ukrainians for credibility to these events because look, Ukrainians attend them, so they're legitimate. These Ukrainians don't even know. I was talking to them. They had no idea of half the stuff that Tikhanovskaya or Karamurza did because they're just not very close to politics. So they invite Ukrainians to make it look better for themselves, and they just sit there and they wait basically until the world resets. They don't want changes in their countries. They just want a new leader. They want sanctions to be lifted. They don't care who the leader is. They don't care who the leader does. They just care that the sanctions are lifted. They can do whatever it is they were doing before, and the world resets and doesn't look at them and thinks that everything is now good and jolly because there is a new person in power. That's what Russians are doing. They're never against the war in Ukraine. They're never against the colonization. They're never against the imperialism. Don't even, a lot of my followers always tell me, oh, we've learned that if you want to know if a Russian is anti-imperial, ask them who Crimea belongs to. No. Ask them what's up with Dagestan. Ask them what's up with Tatarstan. Ask them if those are separate cultures. Because even if you read Yulia Navalnaya's Twitter, you will find out that she thinks that all of the nations in Russia are the same Russian nation, speak the same language, and have the same traditions. And that's her response to people saying that Russia needs to fall apart into different republics so those people can finally have a voice. She says, "Oh, what people?" Yeah.
Yeah. I think that Russia is that old school empire that still exists and could be the last empire if we speak about the country which occupy the other nations, the other countries which are in the Russian Federation. Many of the countries, as Anna said, already passed this way to the collapse of the imperial regimes like United Kingdom, Germany, France. They all mainly give up or giving up their colonies. Russia didn't do it. Russia partially did it, but under the pressure of the First World War and also under the pressure of the Communist Revolution. But now the collapse of Russia is just imminent. It's just a matter of time. The thing is that Russia cannot be military defeated as it was with Nazi Germany. because they have nuclear weaponry. That's the only argument they have, and they constantly play with this argument. Mm, and they speak about it, they change their doctrine, they want to show this last argument again and again. Um, we'll see how it goes. I think that's why the NATO is very important for Ukraine, for the protection, for the possible protection against Russia in this case. And the only defeat which is possible, I think, for Russia um, is the entire collapse of the Russia from inside out. Like it is also imminent process because those nations, they're so separated. If you check out Chechens and North Caucasus, Tatarstan was mentioned, Khabarovsk. So people are really different in Russia, and they all were taught to be volatile society and not to speak too much. But that also creates the pressure within the Russia itself. There was the post of the war criminal Girkin Strelkov, who now in the Russian prison. So he says that Russia will face the same circumstances as it faced in 1917, and he believes that Ukraine will be victorious in this case, and Russia will collapse. There will be the massive revolution because Russia spent already its resources for the war, its economy, it's at the bridge. You know what is happening with the oil prices now; they're dropping low because the Saudi Arabia decided to produce more oil. So little by little, Russia is coming to that edge. The issue for Ukraine now is to hold the line and survive for this time, because we see that Russia goes all in with its current resources, maybe before the elections in the United States, to get as much ground as possible. Well, for Ukraine, it's a long term story. It could be a long term war. So it's important to continue this military support. And if we see that Ukraine is running out of the resources, um, it's important to secure Ukraine with a NATO membership. That is the only reason. If Russia somehow, let's say, occupies Ukraine, they'll not stop. Ukraine is just one country for them. They want to restore the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire. Putin doesn't need Crimea. Putin doesn't need Donbass, which is now mostly destroyed by the Russian bombs. He needs to restore the previous Russian Empire. He will go to Central Asian republics. We hear in the Russian news that they speak about it all the time, that Russian language is like the policy of the local republics of the Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, deteriorates towards Russia. They always complain, Russia, Russia, Russia. They have this, I agree that Russians do have this chauvinist virus. Not just Russians, let's say, many some of the other countries, but Russians especially, they have this empire and they want to restore it. So if our Western allies let Russia to be successful in Ukraine, it would lead to absolute madness. So they need to compare, okay, should we risk with a NATO membership for Ukraine, or should we risk the rise up of the second Soviet Union in charge of the crazy Russian regime? So, and mainly I agree, it's not just about the Putin, but about the Russian circle, FSB circle, which is now in power. As for democratic Russia, we all saw after the Soviet Union collapsed that Russia tried to develop, or at least try to develop in a democratic way, but it didn't come out. So they again went to the dictatorship. And the only solution, I guess, is to collapse that empire. It will collapse itself, actually. It will be divided into many countries, like Soviet Union was divided. The power of Ukraine was not a democratic one, the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, but then we separated. We develop in a total different manner. That's how Russia will be developed, like many countries of Russia will be developed also in a democratic way. That's This process is absolutely imminent. The important thing for us is to hold on, and that's how I believe it will happen. Unfortunately, from the military perspective, we cannot go to Moscow like to Berlin and put Ukrainian flag or NATO flag there on Kremlin, because yes, again, the story is now that Russia has lots of the nukes. They will use those. In this case, it's 100% if we go to Moscow directly. So that's what holds us from that.
Sorry, there is, as I said, I'm back in New York, and there is a lovely little garbage truck outside of my window. So I decided to, I decided to spare you the pleasure. Well, I partially agree with you and partially disagree with you. Russia said that they would use nukes if Russian territory was going to be invaded. I mean, we all love our new Kursk Oblast, don't we? There are so many memes online about the Kursk Oblast at this point. And I think that Russia's reaction to it was really weak because they couldn't have any reaction. I don't think they're willing to use nukes for anything because that would mean, I mean, this is sort of coming from a psychological point of view, right? Putin is a narcissist. He's not trying to destroy Russia, he's trying to add to his accomplishments and to Russia. So even if we came to Moscow and even if we put NATO flags onto Moscow, the likelihood of him using nukes is very low because that's that's mutually assured destruction. I mean, obviously, I can't say he's not going to do that or Russia's not going to do that, but I also don't believe that Russia's nukes are in the right order. I think the nukes that people are mostly scared of are the like intercontinental missiles. Um, People are scared of him using. There are two classes of nuclear weapons, right? For in layman's terms, we have localized nuclear weapons, and then we have boom, the world is over nuclear weapons.
Tactic and strategic or something.
Yeah, tactical and strategic. And I think tactical and strategic just means so little to many people that it's easier to explain that some of them are localized and they cause damage in basically, yeah, of course, the whole world is going to have some fallout, like you're going to have some radiation, but at the same time it's mostly localized. And then there are nuclear weapons where everyone is dead. Oops. And I don't know the condition of those for Russia. I don't know if Russia is willing to test them themselves. And let's say, even when people mention intercontinental ballistic missiles, because when we talk about the U.S. making some moves, and people in the U.S. are scared that Russia is just going to use like intercontinental ballistics, those are harder to take down. They're not the same ballistic weapons as Ukraine gets on a regular basis. I don't believe that those ballistic weapons are. It's not that I don't believe they're in the right order. We've seen that Russia uses air defense missiles to shoot Ukraine, anti-ship missiles to shoot Ukraine, anti-tank missiles to shoot Ukraine, all its civilians. What are the odds that Russia still has intercontinental ballistic missiles in large numbers intact and they did not modify them down to use them on Ukraine? So, I mean, I don't know. The nuclear narrative about Russia, I don't want to say anything, obviously, in extremes because no one should and no one can. But at the same time, I feel like we're being threatened by this nuclear narrative so much. And I don't believe Russia is not only, maybe they're capable technically, but I don't think they're actually capable of doing that. And I don't think anyone would.
I wouldn't try that to check if they're capable or not. I believe that if there is the death threat for Putin, if, for example, NATO forces or whoever goes to Moscow, I believe that if he faces the death threat, he would use those nukes. That's the idea. So in this case, what should he would lose in this case? So I think that Kursk Oblast is not. It doesn't matter for Russia that much. If mostly for the Putin circle, they all live in Moscow, right? Kursk Oblast, what is happening there is absolutely doesn't matter for Russia. They continue their assault operations on the east. They are willing to sacrifice their own territories for that, at least temporary. And Ukraine understands that it's also temporary in the Kursk Oblast. Ukraine is reaching its probably strategic goals there by dispersing some of the Russian forces. But we see that our army has already reached its maximum at the current stage with the current resources in Kursk. Now Russia tries to counterattack at some points. Well, the idea that Western politicians do believe mostly, as I see, in those threats, especially national security advisors of the White House, they do believe that they don't want to escalate, let's say. They believe that, okay, given now the long-range weaponry permission for Ukraine to be used on Russia is not a good idea. But I think that after all, we're going to come to this decision. And there were some of the publications in the media that in the coming Ramstein meeting, those questions will be looked for again. And there was also the information that probably President Biden, after the elections in the United States, would sign the invitation for Ukraine to join NATO, and would also sign the agreement or the permission for Ukraine to use those long-range missiles on the Russian territory. Right after elections, president still has some time of his duties, of his power, until the inauguration of the next president. So I think he might use that time very successfully. We'll see after Ramstein meeting. We're going to see some of the clues. I hope about it.
I have a third version of everything. I liked your idea of a NATO flag in Kremlin, so here are my reflections. Well, first of all, what Russia does at the moment is a classic nuke speak. You remember that, like, I don't remember too, but I mean, we know about the times of the Cold War. And just as Orwell in his book 1984 described newspeak, so there was this nuke speak when every country wanted to frighten another country with its nuclear potential. So Putin definitely needs this narrative to keep escalating. I always believe that the only party that can escalate is actually the aggressor. I have never seen escalation on the side of our allies or Ukraine. It's actually impossible for a victim to escalate. What I also believe is that these global decision makers, let's say in US, UK, or Germany, have more knowledge about the state of Russian nuclear weapons than we do. Perhaps some intelligence services are working, because why do we have these James Bond movies? There should be some people, even inside the Russian army, reporting about something. And personally, I think that, for example, this change of the nuclear doctrine in Russia that happened recently did not frighten US politician, let's say, because they knew it was coming. It was something new for us, but perhaps, like people in closer circles know such things. And it is also not the symptom of Russia's strengths. If everything went fine in their special military operation, they would not need to change this nuclear doctrine. What they are doing, they are trying to influence those frightened, or especially people with this lack of knowledge in general, who will not elect politicians who escalate and so on. That's why I agree with Denis that it is very likely that if we get, and hopefully we get, a permission to strike back and defend ourselves, this will come after the elections. I don't know at what moment in time, but so that this does not interfere in the process of elections and the choices that people make. Because unfortunately, there are still those who choose fear as their strategy to stop the bully. And for example, the one candidate may use it as an argument against another candidate, that like the Third World War is coming. When in reality, Putin, Kim Jong-un, and even Xi are already fighting in this Third World War. Because what makes it like a term that you use? Well, the majority of wars are named after the end, and the number of countries that directly or indirectly participate in this war is actually big. And if we can imagine, I think actually that Kursk was a great humiliation for Putin, and hopefully it caused some stress among his supporters, among his criminal FSB agents or other people. And these can actually be the people who will act when NATO troops or Ukrainian troops will start moving in the direction of Moscow, with a flag. Maybe they will interfere, thus preventing Putin from committing this loud nuclear suicide, which anyway would be a suicide for him, and quickly substitute him, as it often happens in dark Russian history.
The other thing is that, so in the United States, when you press the red button as a president, there is only one or two people after you in the chain of command who make that happen. I think in Russia it's about 19. And in general, even if Putin presses the red button, it's not like he controls a specific nuke that's aimed at America that's going to fly out, right? First of all, we can see nuclear weapons need to be prepared. So if there is a threat of Putin's life ending or something like that, then the US and the UK and our allies are going to see if those are being prepared to be launched. That's one. Two, the person launching them or the people in the chain of command launching them are not Putin. Are they willing to die for Putin? Because I feel like in Russia, very few people are willing to die for him. The problem is that they're scared. But if he is dying and they're dying and everyone is dying, I don't know if they're going to be doing that. At this point, they're being sent to the front line to die for their country, not because they want to die for their country, but because they perceive it as, I don't know, it's better than jail. But
Money. They
money,
get money,
also money
opportunity to
inside.
get sneakers.
Yeah, money incentives in robbing Ukrainians. What's the money incentive in launching a nuclear weapon that's going to kill you? And we can argue that they're stupid and they wouldn't know, but the people launching nuclear weapons who are actually directly responsible for preparing them and for launching them, that they know what's going to happen. They're not stupid. So are they going to do that for Putin just because Putin is on his way out? Because I feel like with Russians, they're not going to die for their leader, are they? They're going to go after a new leader, because we often see how like Russians rally behind Putin. But another thing that we don't talk about is that it's not, yes, it is a cult of personality, because right now Putin to them is like this big person who's protecting their nation, who's this imperial king. But if Putin is committing nuclear suicide because his life is in danger, do we think they're actually going to continue following him? Because at this point he's weak, you know? The leader has to be strong. Big Tsar.
Yeah, it's I believe that it's all myth about the mighty Russia. The actual Russian regime already showed last year that it's weak internally, and we should wait for some kind of the process start to appear in Russia, like Prigozhin's coup. I mean, the Prigozhin's coup, the attempt to go to take power in Russia. Then there was almost no resistance on the way. Prigozhin shut down many of the Russian helicopters, airplanes, and he was fine about it after all. Yeah, Putin dealt with him, the Russian FSB dealt with him, but by the time there were no any accusations. And he showed how easy it is definitely to take power in Russia. So Russian regime may look stable, but in fact, it is not. The nuclear threats are mostly done by Russia to achieve its own local goals, to show that they still have the red lines. At this stage, I don't think that Russia might use nuclear weaponry at this stage, because there is no such an escalation coming from Ukraine. Even if Ukraine gets the permission to attack the Russian military bases on their territory close to Ukrainian border, still Russia wouldn't suffer that much. I mean, their aviation was displaced mainly, as Western politicians, or sorry, experts say, from the airfield. For example, there is the big airfield still in Baltimore. It's Voronezh. It's called Baltimore. So they moved 90% of the airplanes from that one. I know it for sure. Also, the satellite images show us that Russians try to minimize the risk. Also, they're reinforcing the Kerch Bridge now. So they're expecting that Ukraine might use this long-range missiles to target the Kerch Bridge. And why would they do so if they are sure that they could use nukes, right? So I think they're already expecting this step of the escalation. They also have their own intelligence, and they understand that Ukraine finally will obtain the permission to use ATACMS or cruise missiles to attack the Kerch Bridge. So Russia might lose that connection as well. It will not bring us to the third world war. At least Russia will not use nukes. Also, Putin, as we know, he really likes his life. He likes this Tsar style, fancy cars, palace. He is not like the old Soviet dictators, which didn't have that much luxury on in their own. I mean, in their own property. But Putin really could be the richest man in the world if we combine all of his treasures, richer than Elon Musk for sure. So definitely, he cares about himself. He cares about his kids who live and grandkids who live somewhere outside Russia, let's say. Lavrov has his daughter born in the United States and got her education in London. So I won't say that Russia is really ready to use nuclear weaponry until maybe some definitely life-threatening act from NATO, which, as we see, will probably will never happen because our allies are really careful with every sort of the decision they make. They were very careful at the very beginning of the war, giving Ukraine HIMARS systems, tanks, and after all, aircraft. But we see that every red line which Putin put for himself is being crossed and crossed again. So I don't see how Russia. So I would call that also the escalation, let's say, from our side, right? So we need to escalate as well as Russia does it. But it seems like Russia doesn't have the way to escalate any longer. They just threaten with the words about the nuclear strikes, and that's maximum what they can. Well, probably they may also target like Ukrainian nuclear infrastructure, but I mean power plants, but it will touch not just Ukraine, but Russia, Turkey, Eastern Europe. So I don't think they will do it as well. I mean, direct strikes on that infrastructure. So it's hard to say what it could be in the coming year, but I think it will be more or less the same as this one, maybe without some of the Russian military bases or even the Kerch Bridge. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with a lot of that. I still, I still err on the side of nuclear weapons are likely not going to be used because of the chain of command that, thank God, still exists. But I do agree with most of your other points. I think it's just important to break the myths of like Russia being the strong nuclear country because the U.S. is a much stronger nuclear country, and out of the two of them, I think the U.S. is going to hesitate less than Russia does. Even looking back at everything that had happened in the past, people always say like Russia escalates here, Russia escalates there, but in reality, we've crossed all of Russia's nuclear red lines and all of Russia's red lines, and nothing had happened. So I think we are kind of like we're forgetting that NATO hesitates equally as much as Russia does, and I think, but NATO should be in a position of power. So it's not only us that are not necessarily, or it's not only the Western world that isn't doing as much as they could. It's also Russia. Russia is showing that they're not going to do anything, no matter what Ukraine does at this point. So since we've been fantasizing about what the world would be like if if Russia was defeated and Ukraine won, I think a good conclusion would be, what do you think is the best case scenario? Like, let's say Russia is defeated, Ukraine won, Ukraine is in NATO, Russia is at this brink of we don't know what's going to happen, like Germany in World War II or like Japan. You are in charge of making sure that Russia is not going to become what it used to be. What are your main steps that you would do, that you would enforce?
And I guess we have to be kind so that YouTube does not ban this video. Because, this is an eternal dream of many Ukrainian generations to have an ocean somewhere after the Donetsk region. But it does not seem very likely, especially if we think that nuclear weapons won't be used. And, honestly, I think that this process is not if, but when. It has already started, actually, when Russians' blitzkrieg failed and their true face was exposed, and our allies, whether hesitant or not, started supporting us, and they can now go back and pretend that nothing happened. Sometimes it seems like that when something major happens, like the strike on the children's cancer hospital, but at the same time we see more and more Russian red lines crossed from the Ukrainian and allies side. And this is actually great. And at the same time, quite a complex process. Why? Because for decades, if not centuries, Ukraine was an object of politics, geopolitics, and now we are acting by ourselves. We have a strong voice, we have influence, we cause troubles or we help. And this is both unusual, quite problematic, but at the same time, extremely important. And perhaps it is switches this new level which we achieved, and I don't want to compare it to a video game, but because unfortunately it's too precious. And so I think that Of course, the collapse and the dissolution of the Russian Federation, because many smart people actually say that you cannot control such a large territory and such a poor territory uh, in a democratic way. But it doesn't work like that. Democracies are still smaller. Plus, Russia is being called federation is extremely centralized. It's very different from example from the US, where every state has a lot of independence and differs greatly from each other. In Russia, everything is controlled from the center, including all these republics that in future will become independent countries. So, of course, this will be a complex process, but inevitable. And after this dissolution, perhaps some of these countries will rediscover their cultural identities, rediscover their histories. And the task of the old democracies is to introduce them to the democracy that can adapt to their realities and their context. I don't believe that all of them will become perfect, healthy democracies. That's impossible. I don't think that 90s in Russia were a democratic period because, come on, Yeltsin attacked Chechnya and Yeltsin introduced Putin in this very old style, Tsar style, without like real elections, which later came, but they were already prepared. So this will be a very difficult process. And perhaps if we had more, like, I don't know, money and strength, we should have already started supporting this national liberation movements that exist. And we know that Udmurts, for example, people are demonstrating now in Tatarstan, and our task would be to teach them how to become independent. And then so many people are worried about, petrol prices, gas prices. You will negotiate directly with new republics that will become rich, won't bring all of their money to Moscow, and everything will remain the same. And those who are very afraid should remember about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which actually many people tried to stop, including George Bush. And we all remember Chicken Kiev's speech, right? And nothing actually happened. And this war is not the consequence of the collapse of the Soviet Union. This war is the consequence of the democratic world decision to put stakes on Russia, that Russia will continue to be a guarantee of peace and security, that we should denuke Ukraine, sign Budapest. No, that was a mistake, because right in the 90s, Russia started planning the renovation of the Soviet Union. Why? Because they don't know how to earn money. They are not competitive. They are not competitive with the US or China. They do not create mobile phones you want to buy or cars you like. And the only way is actually to pretend they are still great with this fear and with presence close to the EU borders, or presence close to the United States, somewhere in the waters. But terror and fear cannot work for a long time. So hopefully this process has already started, and the task of all democracies is to control it, because that is the safest way for the empire to collapse.
I
Yeah,
agree.
totally agree. And Russians, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russians were given this the chance to be a democratic state, right? But I think they got it so easily. Like the Soviet Union collapsed without any sort of the big conflicts, let's say, within the Russian society. It wasn't the bloody collapse, and they understood it as some sort of the defeat. They are not nostalgic now, mostly about the Soviet Union, especially people of Putin's age. They see it as the defeat of their personal defeat. So I think that there is no other way than to collapse Russia again. It will collapse itself, and hopefully it will not bring severe devastation to the region, and hopefully China will not profit from it. Like because we may see the other big threat. I think it's also why United States and other Western allies are kind of careful about Russia nowadays, because they see the big threat from China, and China really may profit from that collapse. So I think this collapse should be like more or less controlled. That's what they say, but I guess it's hard to control it after all. But this process it's inevitable, and I think we're gonna see it in the coming years, like 10 maximum.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the best way to make sure that Russia doesn't come back in the same light or doesn't repeat the same pattern is really, as I said, we need to treat it like post World War II Germany and like Japan, where it's very controlled and where kids are being taught correct information. And when I say like re-educated, I don't mean what Russia does to Ukrainian children. I mean, educated with real information, not Russian propaganda that was made up by, I don't know, AI on the internet and Russian bot farms. Because, I always give this example. There is a Russian author that wrote 346 books in 4 years between 2018 and 2022. And all of these books are like Battlefield Sevastopol, collapse of Ukraine, Nazis. There is nothing about him on the internet. And these books are about 500 pages each. So there is absolutely zero chance that someone can write 300 something books in 4 years, 500 plus pages each, unless they're all the same book with a different ending, So I hope that we stop giving that AI that writes it the voice to educate future generations of Russians. Well, thank you guys for such an interesting discussion. It's always a pleasure to have you here. I hope I see you here again next time. And, last time it was Denis and Starsky. This time it's Anna and Denis. And I think these are very good, very good sort of differing opinions that also mesh together well, because I think you and Starsky bounce off each other very well, Denis. So thank you so much for being here again. Hopefully I'll see you here next time, and thank you for having this conversation with me.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for having us. Yeah.
So these were some very interesting red lines, and some of them we fantasized and some of them we drew, but I hope that made for a very interesting discussion because none of them are really as far-fetched as it may seem. If you enjoyed this conversation and would want to hear more like it, please don't forget to subscribe to The Gaze and UATV English, so the channels where you're watching it. And in the meanwhile, please give this video a like and send it to a friend so more people can experience what it's like to fantasize the end of Russia. And of course, don't forget to leave us a comment because I read all of them and I am very interested in your opinion. And I will see you next time when we will be crossing some more of your red lines or maybe somebody else's.